Across Australia, there are stories that have been carried, word for word, tune for tune, step for step, across more than 7,000 years without ever being written down. Some of them describe coastlines that vanished beneath the ocean before the pyramids were built. Some encode star maps precise enough that professional astronomers have used them to locate real celestial objects. And every time researchers have found a way to actually test one of these stories against physical evidence, the story has checked out. Nobody in oral history research anywhere else in the world has found anything that comes close. Subscribe now for more videos. Alright, let's continue. What a songline actually is, songlines are pathways of knowledge that run across the Australian landscape, encoded into song, story, dance, and ceremony, connecting specific places to the ancestral beings and events of the dreaming. They aren't simply myths layered onto a map after the fact. They function as a genuine information system, describing routes across country, the location of water and food, seasonal changes, law, and history, all carried orally across an unbroken chain of teaching that in some cases stretches back tens of thousands of years. Many songlines are restricted knowledge, specific to particular family groups, genders, or ceremonial authority, and not something outside researchers are permitted to access or repeat in detail. What makes this story possible to tell without overstepping that boundary is that the strongest scientific evidence for their accuracy has come from cases specific communities have chosen to share publicly in partnership with researchers, precisely because the results were considered too significant to keep quiet. The coastline that shouldn't still be remembered, the most rigorously tested example, comes from the work of geographer Patrick Nunn and linguist Nicholas Reid, published in the journal Australian Geographer in 2016. Nunn and Reid examined a specific category of Aboriginal oral tradition found across at least 21 distinct locations around the Australian coastline. Stories describing a time when the coast extended much further out to sea than it does today, before the ocean rose and swallowed the land. That description is not folklore dressed up as memory. It's geologically accurate. At the end of the last ice age, global sea levels were dramatically lower, and the Australian coastline genuinely did extend kilometres further out in many regions than it does now. As the ice melted and the ocean rose, that process played out gradually over thousands of years, finally stabilising to roughly its current position somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 years ago, depending on the specific location being studied. For the oral traditions Nunn and Reid examined to be accurate, they'd need to have been transmitted, without significant distortion, for at least 7,000 years, and in some cases considerably longer. That figure isn't a rough guess. It's derived directly from comparing the details described in the stories against the known, dated geological record of when specific coastal features would have actually existed in the form the stories describe. In multiple cases, the match was precise enough that Nunn and Reid concluded the sea level information had likely been preserved with minimal alteration across roughly 300 generations. Why that time frame breaks the usual rules. This is the part that genuinely stumped researchers outside Australia when the findings were published. The standard, well-established assumption in oral history and folklore studies is that unwritten stories degrade fairly quickly, typically becoming unreliable as accurate historical records somewhere within a few hundred years, occasionally stretching to 1,000 under unusually stable conditions. Beyond that, details are generally assumed to shift, embellish, or fade entirely as each generation retells the story slightly differently than the last. 7,000 years is roughly 7 to 10 times longer than the outer edge of what was previously considered plausible for accurate oral transmission anywhere else studied in the world. Nunn and Reid's own explanation for how this was achieved points to the specific cultural structures built around these stories. Aboriginal knowledge transmission traditionally involves strict, formalised processes, verification by multiple separate knowledge holders, ceremonial repetition, and direct accountability for accurately passing information to the next generation, more closely resembling the rigour of a formal information system than casual storytelling passed down a family line. Even accounting for that explanation, the researchers themselves acknowledge the sheer scale of accuracy involved remains difficult to fully account for using anything comparable found elsewhere in global oral history research. The sky as a second kind of map sea level memory isn't the only documented case where Aboriginal oral tradition has lined up precisely with independently verifiable science. Aboriginal astronomical traditions across multiple language groups encode detailed knowledge of the movement of specific stars and planets, seasonal calendars tied to the rising and setting of particular constellations, and in several documented cases, oral descriptions consistent with genuine, rare astronomical events. Researchers working with Indigenous astronomy have pointed to accounts describing the variable brightness of certain stars decades or centuries before Western astronomers formally documented the same stars as variable, meaning their brightness genuinely does fluctuate over time. Because these stars change brightness slowly enough that it isn't obvious within a single human lifetime of casual observation, accurately describing that variability requires sustained, careful observation carried out and compared across multiple generations, precisely the kind of long-term, structured knowledge transmission the coastal flooding stories also depended on. Why nobody has fully explained the mechanism, here's where the mystery actually sits. And it's a more interesting question than simply, how did people remember things for a long time? Every human culture tells stories across generations. What's specific to these confirmed Aboriginal cases is the combination of extraordinary duration and extraordinary precision, held together simultaneously across environmental changes, colonial disruption, and the loss of entire language groups in the intervening millennia. Researchers have proposed genuine mechanisms, formalized memory techniques, ceremonial repetition, enforcing consistency, multiple independent knowledge holders cross-checking each other's version of events, ecological knowledge embedded directly into practical, repeated activity rather than passive storytelling. Each of those explanations plausibly contributes something. None of them, on their own or combined, fully account for how information this specific survived this long, across societies that, in many regions, endured massive disruption to exactly the kind of intergenerational teaching structures these traditions depend on. What this actually tells us, the songlines that describe drowned coastlines and shifting stars aren't presented by the researchers who study them as mystical or supernatural. They're presented as a genuine, verified information technology, one that operated successfully for longer than any comparable system studied anywhere else on Earth, using tools, memory, ceremony, and structure rather than writing. What science hasn't been able to do is fully explain how a system built entirely on human memory managed to outperform every other oral tradition studied anywhere in the world by a margin of thousands of years, and continue doing so today, in communities where these songlines are still actively taught, still actively carried, and in the specific cases researchers have been permitted to study, still, checking out exactly as accurately as they did the first time somebody thought to test them against the ground itself.